Hello YouTube, welcome back to Nutkin Farm. Nice spring afternoon here in block 1, and I'm starting my video at the tree called Stupid, and Stupid's being very clever at the moment because Stupid's got flowers all over it and the tree is looking overall very healthy. I am pretty sure that this is actually a Macadamia H2, an old variety bred in Queensland, the original of which is now a heritage listed tree. It was so important to the industry. It has a very undignified life now, being a rootstock for other trees because it's a very strong tree in its own right. But it was eventually rejected because its nuts tended to stick to the tree too long, and they had a weird ability to stick to the shell of the nut so that you wouldn't really get kernels out easily. When you did, they had lots of whole kernels, and apparently they taste absolutely delicious. But for that reason, the industry sort of scorned the H2 as a tree that would bear nuts. You can still find some of them around the northern rivers in places like Corndale, Dorreby, Dunoon, the early plantations around the area. Not so much in the Alstonville Plateau. But it's funny how the industry can pick some stars and plant them widely and then ignore others. And I thought in this video I'd do a little bit of a follow-up on a video I did a couple of years ago when I planted trees that literally nobody else was planting in New South Wales. You can take advice from any number of agronomists or whatever, but if you're trying to have a bit of an experiment and you're interested in macadamia genealogy and where our varieties came from and where some countries adopted some varieties and some rejected them, I dug in and got two particular varieties that I called orphans because they weren't used for breeding, they weren't used for rootstocks, they were cropping varieties that were trialled in Australia, but after a few years of trials, for whatever reason, they were deemed unworthy and not really sent out to farmers and promoted to farmers on the basis of you can get good crops out of these trees. And so I planted two of them, and here is a bit of a review of how they're going. First of all, this is the 835. It's actually flowered for the first time this year, but look, barely 3 years in the ground and it's about double my height. It's a vigorous tree. Normally when trees start to flower, you get the one or two shy flower and rarely any nuts. But what I'm seeing here with these nuts, and you can see them close up, see the brown parts in the middle? Some of those nuts have been pollinated, and I expect them to possibly be taken to full term as macadamias. Now, Macadamia 835 has a small nut. It has an enormous percentage of whole kernel, the highest of any tested to date. It's got quite a hard, crunchy nut, and that's why the kernel tends to come out whole. And so for that reason, it's probably quite relevant in today's marketplace because whole nuts are the things that processors can't get enough of at the moment. They've got all the chips and pieces they need from other varieties that bear perhaps a higher yield, but don't have as many whole kernels. So I'm trialling 835 as a means of just looking at whether or not some of these varieties that were shunned for other reasons might now be worth taking up again because the industry has changed around us. Here's another 835 here, again with flowers. Now the 835 genetically has parts of 246, and the original 246 is used in a lot of breeding programs, and you can find 246 in most varieties that are grown nowadays one way or another. Here's another 835 here, and yeah, it's definitely got some flowers a little bit earlier than I expected. I would have thought it might take another year to crop. But yeah, it bears lots of relatively small but very whole macadamia nuts, and I think it might have a future so long as the yield is enough to give farmers a bit of a bonus for whole kernels, and that's something that's being introduced to the industry, particularly by Marquee. They're starting to pay growers differently based on the number of whole kernels they get. And in a way, I don't blame them, because they really want the whole kernels. So you can have trees with enormous numbers of flowers and enormous numbers of nuts, but if it's the whole ones they want, and the whole ones they're willing to pay the farmer the most for, then you would expect farmers to eventually move in that direction. Here's a couple more 835s here. So, we've got a reasonably uniform picture this season. They're quite big racemes, about as big as my hand. You can definitely get longer than that on many varieties. I don't know whether it means that the nuts will come in bunches or in singles and doubles, which is sort of more standard for a macadamia. But we'll have a look through the season and see what it starts bearing. One of the nice things about looking at young macadamia trees bearing for the first time is you can get up close and personal with the crops they put on. There's another orphan that I grew, and it was actually thrown in as a bonus by the nurseryman who heard my story and was interested in my experimentation. That was the 788. The 788 is a descendant of the only other tree to come from the same orchard as 246. So it's a completely different bloodline, and it's only been used in the 788. And the 788 is known to my South African subscribers because it's one of the popular varieties there. It was tested in Australia. I read up on its testing. It had the weirdest history. It seemed to do well in all the tests. And as late as about 2012, the notes were coming back that the 788 was showing great promise. And then suddenly it just disappeared. People weren't promoting it. Farms weren't planting it. Certainly in New South Wales, it became sort of a literal unknown. Whereas at the same time, because of the timing of the industry, it came out in a big way in South Africa and was planted there. Now look at this specimen. Absolutely huge racemes that are full of pollen. Some of those have been pollinated, you can see. Some flowers are still to come out, so I'm gathering from this that it has probably an extended flowering period. Now, here's another one where the flowering has largely finished. You can see those brown bits in the inside of the flower. That's telling you that it's reaching the end of its run, although there's still a few active flowers, and I've seen a couple of bees sort of hanging around it. So I suspect these 788s may well bear me some nuts. So I can't tell you the story of why 788 was orphaned in Australia. I can tell you that it's a successful variety in South Africa, where the climate is not entirely different from Australia. Here's another one right here. Nice crop of flowers at a slightly earlier stage. And the tree, I'm now standing back, it's well over double my height. Nothing wrong with the vigour of the tree, so that wasn't why it was rejected. It's a bit of a mystery, that one. It can come in at about 40% kernel. I don't know what it's like for whole kernels. But look, we've got to be a little bit humble here in Australia and learn some lessons from the South Africans, because they do know what they're doing. And in many cases, we're starting to learn from them. So back from the old orchard that the 788 came from, the 246 over here, it's doing fine. There's nothing wrong with it. Most of my 246s now have 1 or 2 flowers this year, but they're much more shy than the 788 over here. And this is my final 788, and it's really, really looking a treat. These racemes are, I'm looking around lots of flowers this spring, and this is really luxurious. Have a look at those. Just gorgeous. And it's really going to be interesting to see what it holds as crop. I'm going to be very interested come autumn to taste the nuts, to see how good they taste. Also take a look at how thick the shells are, and that will give us some idea much longer after the original testing as to whether the variety might be worth another look. And you know, down the track also, I'm still trying to get hold of these 783s. We've got some transport issues from Queensland, unfortunately. They've got to come from near Bundaberg down to the Northern Rivers, and we're trying to find a way of doing that that won't cost an arm and a leg, but we'll hopefully get there and trial the 783 for you, which is definitely another orphan in the scheme of things. Meanwhile, of course, you know, those trees are growing amongst a bunch of trees that I don't really know the variety of, but whatever they are happy and they're doing particularly well. And that, I think, is a fitting end for this little update. I will link at the end of the video to my original spiel on the orphans that led to the 835 and the 788. And you can find out more there if you're new to the channel. If you've already seen those earlier videos, you won't need that kind of a backup. But good to have you along in any event. Bye bye for now.